Well, Fastamai, good afternoon and welcome to Manx Radio's Budget 2023 programme brought to you by Crow, Isle of Man. We are live in the Millennium Room in the Legislative Buildings, not far away at all from where members of Tynwald are currently debating the budget as we speak. The main theme this year, investing in our island. Over the next couple of hours, we'll be talking about what this year's announcements might mean for you. We are also joined by an invited audience who will hopefully help us to make sense of all the facts and figures. Hello, audience. Look how excited they are. If you have a question or comment over the next couple of hours, then you can get in touch as well. Email studio@manxradio.com or you can text 166 177. We have a panel with us as well who we will meet in just a moment. But first of all, Phil Gawne, you were watching the Treasury Minister speak this morning. Can you give us a rundown of his budget highlights?
Well, the summary is we're spending about just shy of 10% of our reserves to maintain our revenue expenditure this year. So that's an awful lot of money being spent to prop up public expenditure. The positive from the government side is a £100 million economic development fund, which has been announced. I mean, it's been announced several times over the last year, but it's there in the budget, serious money going in. So I think the question that remains unanswered, and maybe our panel will help us answer this question, is how are we going to plug this massive funding gap over the course of the next few years?
I suppose somebody listening, though, Phil, might say, what do we have reserves for if they're not for spending when we need them?
Indeed, and no doubt that's what the Treasury Minister will say, that we are spending money because we need to spend it at the moment. But certainly the economic strategy really does need to kick in quite quickly to be able to address this clear spending deficit.
Well, let's meet our panel just now then. First, Senior Tax Manager from Crow, Pam Harvey. Pam, I think it's fair to say you haven't had a great deal of time to digest this year's budget, but what would be your initial impression?
Well, obviously, the Minister said that it was a financially responsible budget to invest in the growth and the future of our island, but there appeared to be very small changes with no big impact.
OK, we'll talk more about that in a moment. John Webster is chair at the Manx Technology Group and also a former government economic advisor. John, is this a budget that you would have been happy to put your name to?
No. I think he's kicked the can down the road. He was left with a pretty poor legacy. But as Phil has just said, one of the issues is the large structural deficit. And just to spell that out, total expenditure by the Isle of Man government is about 1.2 billion. Round terms. Our structural deficit is about 150 million, so more than 10% we're spending on revenue more than we earn, and we have exhausted some of our savings already, and our NI fund is being used to support revenue expenditure. That to me is a major error.
But John, is that not just a sign of the times, the way things are now across the board, not just here in the Isle of Man?
Well, you can say it's COVID, and you can put other reasons, Ukraine war, etc. But unless you have a substantial and significant indication of exactly how you're going to resolve things, people lose confidence. And one of the issues is there's been no detail on how we're going to grow the economy.
OK, again, we'll come back to that shortly. Ian Crawford is Director at Chase Financial Services. Ian, from your initial impression, what would you say this budget means for the average person, if I can put it like that, listening to this programme?
I think, looking at some of Dr Allison's comments in advance of the budget, he said the government will face hard decisions about spending in 2023. Record inflation, high energy prices taking a toll, public finances in the past year, all the support payments. I think for the man in the street, this is a good move in the right direction with all the personal benefits coming through today. So I'm in favour of that. I think, as Phil mentioned before, it's economic development now is the big thing we need to focus on, but more importantly it's delivery, because I think we've failed in delivery in the past in some. So this is a chance at both ends of the scale to get things right and make some progress.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Kristen MacDonald is the president of the Isle of Man Chamber of Commerce. Kristen, what would you say the Chamber's initial feeling about Budget 2023 is?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. I'm a little bit disappointed to see that the target of 1.5% of non-pay related cost savings is what the sort of government's been given. I think in the private sector we're seeing massive squeezes on budgets, not just non-pay but pay as well. So it feels a little bit out of kilter for the government to have, as John Webster said, a fairly huge deficit and black hole in their budget, and yet they're only, fiddling around the edges in terms of this 1.5% non-pay related savings. So the private sector, the businesses are having to become a lot more efficient. We're having to do a lot of work around budgeting, cutting costs. I don't really feel like this budget acknowledges the pain that the private sector's feeling, and doesn't seem that the public sector is bearing any of that.
Okay, and just finally, Kira Sauby is a recent astrophysics and cosmology graduate. That makes me feel clever just saying it, Kira. And you've just recently come back to the Isle of Man. You're also a member of the Manx Labour Party. How closely do you generally follow budget developments?
Pretty closely, I'd say. I'm very interested in this sort of thing. And, I work in finance as well, so it's quite relevant to my job. So, I think this budget is an interesting one. There are some things that I quite like in it. There are some things that I don't. I'm sure we'll probably go into more detail on that later on. But I think overall it's very short-term thinking, getting us to the next election kind of thing 5 years down the line. And I'd love to see someone come into Treasury and actually deliver a budget that's for the long term, for the future of the island. And I'm not sure that that's what Minister Allison has done today.
Do you know, Kira, you are exactly the sort of person, though, that government needs to be speaking to. You are a graduate who's come back to the island. What was it that brought you back here, then?
I think I knew that I wanted to work in the finance industry, and the Isle of Man's finance industry is very strong. And so there was good job opportunities for me, and also the ability to live at home and get some saving done to hopefully buy a house, although that's looking quite unlikely with the state of the Isle of Man housing market at the moment, unfortunately.
That's interesting, actually. Not much mention, Phil, of housing in the budget and initiatives there.
No, the only reference that I could see to housing was an increase of 5% in housing allowance for those people on benefits, and a 5% increase, bearing in mind the way in which housing costs have gone up over the course of this last 12 months is, it's interesting. But we have people here who can help us potentially fill the gap. We've got Paul Hardman and Dean Kucher, and both are, one has already established a business here, another is hoping to. Are you hearing enough from government, Paul Hardman, to encourage you that we're on the right track?
Well, I hear a lot of words around growth and attract, and one thing that you can't do is you can't continue to fund a deficit by reserves. You've got to attract people, and you've got to attract income, and you've got to attract the right demographic. You've got to have the people who are in the right age groups to be paying tax and to be paying national insurance, and that is the way, in my opinion, to encourage or to reduce a deficit. So yes, I am hearing the right noises in terms of growth and attraction, but I would want more detail and more speed around that.
And of course, Dean, you're hoping to establish a business on the island. You've had various conversations with various ministers. Is this going well, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say it's very welcoming here. I think it's a beautiful place to establish a business. Both the central location. It seems like a really good workforce here. We're going to attract people, but we'll also hire people. But we've got some really good signs and working, in association with other people. So we're very excited about it. I think the island has a lot to offer. I think I see the upside down the road of this being a great place to have a business and to live.
And what would you say are the key features that would attract a business like yours to the island?
Well, one of the things that, we're in a growth stage, so we're looking for financing too. So we're definitely interested in getting investment into the company, but we feel like this is a good place to be for the markets. We have an established business in the U.S. right now where it's a big customer base, so you can't expect to make all your money from this market because it's a small customer base, but it'd be a great place to have a world headquarters where you can work in these different markets. And it just feels like the Isle of Man is very welcoming. Like I said, I've met a lot of the ministers. I've even met the chief minister and the president. Everybody's been very encouraging to come here. So we're looking forward to being here.
So, Beth, at least there's a glimmer of optimism in the room.
Well, let's go back to you, John Webster, because I'm intrigued to know if you had to formulate a budget plan for this year, what would it have been then? What would you have done?
Well, one issue I would definitely have tackled is property. I'd try to inhibit the amount of speculation that takes place in property. There's a lot of empty properties on the island, a lot of rented properties, and a lot of properties being used for accommodation addresses. I think taxation can be used to reduce the demand by speculators and to increase at the same time revenue for government. And if you were to reduce that demand, then you'd reduce the property prices available for young locals. And we all know that one of the inhibitors to people remaining on or coming back to the Isle of Man is the high price of property. So that would be a major element I would have tackled in the budget, and I think it's a major omission, to be honest.
Kira?
Yeah, I would agree with John Webster there, that not seeing anything in the budget about housing is a real sort of slap in the face, especially to young people who want to come back to the island. We're in the middle of a housing crisis on the island. Rent is extortionate, and buying a property is almost unimaginable to me at the moment. And so to not see anything mentioned in the budget about that is really disappointing. Furthermore, not seeing anything about social housing, specifically anything that councils and commissioners around the island can do, increases in their budgets through the DOI, is also really disappointing. I know that they're really struggling to fund their housing committees at the moment and social housing, and so it would be really good to see more money put into that, and it's unfortunately just been completely missed out, completely neglected.
Chris MacDonald, you're nodding there, something you agree with?
Yeah, definitely. All of those points completely agree with. We've got this aspiration to grow the population to 100,000, but at the moment we simply don't have the housing capacity to meet that. And yes, there's a lot being built, and we've got the plans in place to do some of that, but it's not really quick enough. And I'm not sure the planning side of it really works. In a lot of it, we're still building. It kills me every time I drive down past the brand new estate there down in Ballasalla, and there's not a single solar panel or anything there, and we're in the middle of an energy crisis, and currently solar panels are the same price to install as roof tiles, and you just think there's some real fundamental no-brainers being missed here. And again, it's about having those pressures put in the right place. People will achieve some of these targets in terms of cost savings or energy efficiency and things like that if you give them the incentive to. I don't see a lot of incentives in a lot of what's been announced today to drive any of that agenda. And again, on the energy side of things as well, it's again, there wasn't a huge mention of much that I could see around green energy or anything around that. So yeah, there's a lot of missed opportunities here, I think, that I would have liked to have seen brought in.
Kira again?
Yeah, so going on from what Kristen said, climate is something that's very close to my heart. I helped sort of co-found the Isle of Man Student Climate Network, and so that's something that I was looking very closely for in this budget. However, there's hardly any notice of it, apart from a small line that references the Climate Change Adaptation Fund, which is getting extra money. However, I see that being very short-sighted. We don't want to be adapting to climate change. We want to be mitigating against it. This is, by just adapting to it, you're creating a future burden for future generations, because we'll have to keep on funding adaptation rather than funding mitigation. Mitigation is a large expense that would come soon. It would come now. However, adaptation is something that would actually would have to carry on for generations and would continue being an expense the entire way through. Furthermore, I'm not sure how it'd actually be used. The Climate Change Fund has historically been quite underused because no one really seems to know what to actually use it for. They just keep making empty promises.
Okay. Ian, can I bring you in there? Because you were nodding before. You think some good points raised here.
Just coming back to the housing situation, and I'd endorse some of the comments made here already. I'm a bit disappointed that we haven't made more progress on this, but for example, where I work, we regularly raise in excess of £100 million every year in mortgage applications. Now, we're in the crisis of inflation, high interest rates, stress testing and everything else, but we're being held back here. And what we're talking about a minute ago was aiming for 100,000 population by 2047, is it? We've got a long way to go to achieve that, really. We need the housing stock. We need to develop these sites. We need to push the boat out on this to attract people to this island who are going to come in and fill key and important jobs and be big and good contributors to the economy. I think our sights are aiming too high at the moment. We've got a long way to go to get back on track in that respect.
So, Tracy Hempworth, I mean, you've had some concerns about not so much attracting new people to the island, but making sure the ones here are encouraged to stay and feel as though they can afford to be here.
We've got about 12 young dental nurses who work for us at Abbey Dental and One Dental Clinic, and they are finding that they can't afford to pay their rents. One is being evicted and has been told that her £750 a month rent is going to increase to £1,500 a month. At the moment, her budget is stretched. She's got a young child, and there's no provision for that. There's provision for people who are on benefits, but if you are working and want to stay out of the benefit system, where's she going to live? It's better for her to quit work and go on benefits and be provided accommodation than to stay in work. There's no provision for people who are going to be made homeless on the Isle of Man because of this crisis. And there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to rent, and you can't get a mortgage. No chance.
John Webster?
I think another very important issue, which was touched upon by Kristen before, was the difference between the private sector and the public sector. Now, this is clearly shown if you look at the median salaries of the private and public sector. The difference is about £10,000 per year for the median salary, and the public sector workers work a couple of hours less per week. Now, that is a major issue, and we're seeing that we talk about increasing the number of private sector jobs. It's important to ensure that those jobs are productive, high-paid jobs, which produce new money for the Isle of Man, because there's a big difference between bringing in, say, someone who's working in the domestic economy and someone who's working in an export-orientated sector, which is bringing in import from either goods or services sold abroad. It's very important to drill down and get those details. And it's also important to look at the private sector, because we do not want a divisive element arising where the public sector is seen to be completely different and doing much better than the private sector.
Pam Harvey, what would you say to those comments?
Well, what I picked up on within the budget speech was that he said that there was a 57% increase in tax registrations. There was an increase in tax registrations, and 57% of those were under 40. So how many of those under 40s are employed and are contributing to the economy? We know firsthand in our business that we are managing to recruit qualified staff to bring them to the Isle of Man, but then they can't find anywhere to live. And it's particularly difficult if they've got children. There's just not the rented properties out there for them.
You're listening to Manx Radio's budget programme. It is just coming up to 12:25. We'll be back after this.
Manx Radio. The Manx Radio Budget Special is brought to you by Crow Isle of Man. Chartered Accountants. Visit crow.im or call 627 335.
And we are live from the Millennium Room in the Legislative Buildings. Just want to read you a text message we got in from Pammy, who says, this government has too many employees on the books. The government's overheads per population is grossly too heavy. We're only a population of 85,000. Does anyone know what the total running cost is for those people? If we grow the population to 100,000, where are the doctors coming from? I'm so angry with the lack of communication and common sense in this government. If it was a private business, they'd have been sacked for overspending, Phil.
Well, it seems an appropriate point to bring in Debbie Halsall, I want to say from the TDWU, but it's not, it's Unite, isn't it? And Geraldine O'Neill from the NASUWT. Is the public sector bloated and overly generously paid?
If that was the case, they wouldn't have an issue with recruitment and retention at the moment. There's this myth that the public sector worker is paid an awful lot of money. You made reference to the medium wage, and we've got people who we represent who are on about £320 a week, and they have to find from their rentals, etc. So when this government comes out and says the plan is to grow the population, first of all, have your infrastructure in place, your health services, and also your key workers in education, to make this place a lucrative place to come, not like the adjacent island in the UK. So as regards to that, I would actually not agree with what you said. The private sector is much better to work for than the public sector.
And Geraldine, I mean, your union continues to have a dispute with the Department of Education.
We do indeed. And, I'd just like to echo, of course, everybody wants to make money in an economy, but it should be a partnership between capitalism and also the public sector that delivers the services. Because to be quite honest, without your teachers, your nurses, your doctors, your people who clean the street and work for government, without all of those key workers, and I'm not talking about the excessive people that supposedly are employed by government, because I don't know who they are. We have a severe recruitment and retention crisis. We have our graduates who have studied at university having to go to food banks. So when you're talking about private sector and public sector, I would really like to see those figures that you have. We have figures and we'd like to have that conversation with you. Let's have the comparison of your figures with our figures, and let's see how we deliver the services here and how we actually make the Isle of Man a place that has infrastructure to bring people to the island. All this talk about growing the population, I think it's actually hilarious. We have failing public services, we have failing infrastructure. We will not grow the Isle of Man until you get that right for the people who live here, first of all, before you start attracting people to come here. If I was coming to somewhere to emigrate, the first thing I would look at would be health services and education. Well, I wouldn't be coming to the Isle of Man at the moment if that was the case. So get those things right. We educate everybody, every job that you have. The teachers educate. Whatever you are in life, teachers educate. So if we can't keep the people who live and work here staying here, we have a serious problem.
Christian McDonald, I'm going to come to you there. Private sector is much better to work in than the public sector.
I think it's very different, in all honesty, and I think part of the thing with the public sector pay is that there's also a final salary pension there for most people waiting for it in the end. That's just not something you get in the private sector and hasn't been for a very, very long time. So there is an implicit balance there as well. And I think from very quick maths, £320 a week sounded to me like it was a bit below minimum wage. I don't know if that's accurate or not. But I have to agree with most of your points, though. Teachers, I think, are one of the most important parts of society. And what we're seeing now in terms of the skill shortage is as a result of a chronic failure from education in the past for not equipping the young people with the right skills. We've got a big mental health crisis, and a lot of it is no one's actually been told how to manage that. We're teaching things in schools which we've taught for about the past 60, 100 years and assuming that they're still relevant, and they're simply not anymore. So we've got people coming out of the education system that aren't necessarily completely well equipped for not just the world of work, but the modern world. And I think that there's a contract implicitly being broken here, that when you look at the funding from the tax system to go into the education and the healthcare systems, that's assumed that it will be used efficiently. And I don't think we're seeing that. We're seeing massive use of bank staff in terms of the health service and things like that. That's not good use of funds. And again, you've got, there's a chronic recruitment problem there as well, same as there is in the private sector. And it all comes down to this lack of skills and lack of good workforce training, I think, is really the root cause of a lot of this. And this has been a systemic thing that's been built up over years and years. There aren't really any short fixes to this. But at the moment, what I'm struggling to see is that the efficiency programs in government just don't seem to be there. And it's not entirely fair to say, oh, it's massively inefficient, and to challenge, one of the CEOs of one of the departments to say, you're right, you need to make your business, your service more efficient, because I don't know that that's necessarily a good way to do it. It's about providing the tools to make that happen and providing some of the practices to make that happen. We still have a vast amount of paper forms floating around government. No one wants to interact with a civil service that's based on paper. A lot of young people doing business today, a lot of modern people doing business, it's all app-driven, it's all online, and at the end of every piece of paper, at the end of every phone call that has to be made into government is a person. Whereas a lot of businesses now, at the end of the app is a machine, and it does the job for you. And that comes back to things like minimum wage, which is rising into parity with living wage. That makes it difficult for employers to pay, which forces them to find further efficiencies, cut further services. And again, there's a contract being broken there. You raise the minimum wage because you're investing in your people so that they can be more productive and move up that pay scale and do those higher paid jobs. And that's just not what we're seeing at the moment.
John Webster, are we then being a little bit naive in thinking about growing the population by that level?
Yeah, I think so. But just addressing the immediate question and then coming on to that, if I may. First of all, factually, the private sector median wage is below that of the public sector. Now, I've worked in both, and it's not a criticism of the public sector to say that the private sector wages are low. It's also not a criticism of any sector to say that we need to increase the number of high-paid, productive jobs in the private sector. That has to be the starting point to fund the teachers and the doctors, etc., we all need.
But if I can just interrupt you, it's not a popular decision, though, is it? The public doesn't hear that and think that has only direct relevance to me. That's the problem, isn't it?
Well, that is the problem, that people don't see the relevance between economic growth and the revenue that needs to be generated to pay for the services that we all need. Now, in advance of coming on the radio today, I did a bit of a survey, a very informal one, only a couple of hundred people, and I said basically, what has improved in your lives since 2016? And apart from Starbucks, a better bus service, faster internet from a few people, most people said lives have deteriorated in the last 5 or 6 years. Now, that's not a great thing to have happen when we are, as an island, trying to promote ourselves to outsiders. So coming back to the point you made, Beth, should we be going for 100,000? I'd say no, unless those people are productive and helping us to develop. Simply saying, come to the Isle of Man, who are you, whoever you are, there are no restrictions or qualifications or whatever, is likely to attract the people we may not want rather than the people we actually do need. Therefore, in my view, the starting point has got to be to create jobs, because those jobs attract the people that we want to have here. We've got an example at the end of the table of someone who's come back. One of the reasons she gave was to have because there was a good job available. That has to be the starting point.
Ciara?
Yeah, I just want to go back to what Geraldine and Debbie have said previously. The point was made that public sector workers get a high pension, but a high pension doesn't help public sector workers now when they're currently using food banks and they're currently struggling with their current pay. So saying that they get a high pension is not a valid point in my opinion at the moment. Budget planning was also brought up, and that doesn't help when you don't have the money for the basics in the first place. I would 100% back a public sector pay rise, and this budget has not made any sort of consolation for that whatsoever. It's disappointing that it's not in there. Also brought up was the difference in salaries between the public and private sectors, and the range of private sector salaries is going to be much higher because you have these incredibly highly paid CEOs versus people who work in private companies in sort of low paid and low skilled jobs. Whereas that doesn't really exist in the public sector. It's a much narrower range of salaries. It's rare that you'd find someone who's paid more than six figures in the public sector. They do exist, but they're rare. And so therefore, I think that even the public skilled jobs are much more highly skilled. They're doctors, they're teachers, they're people who society relies on. They're the key workers that we were so reliant on in COVID, and they're getting paid a salary that is disproportionate to the amount of skill that they have.
Phil?
And one of those rare things that exists in Manx politics, young people who are interested in it. Ollie Sykes and Archie Elliott, what have you noted in this budget in particular?
Well, with the title of the budget being Invest in Our Island Plan, the Island Plan sort of indicates that we need to invest in our youth. And the only thing I can really see from this budget that incentivises young people to come back is the National Insurance Holidays Scheme. It's nothing to retain young people on islands. And I'd also like to add, in terms of the island plan, we want sort of a vibrant culture. There's no increase into the culture and the arts in there, to my knowledge. So I think it's quite disappointing. I speak to many of my peers, and some of them, most of them, will probably go to uni and not return. A conversation a few weeks ago was from a teacher saying to a student, "Oh, would any of you consider going into teaching?" And someone said, "I would consider it, but because of the way things are at the moment, I don't think that's an option for me."
Archie?
Well, I would add on to would respond to some of the points that Debbie and Geraldine have made, because the public sector here, we're not talking about the essential jobs which obviously need to be invested in, such as teaching, our healthcare system and sort like that. We're talking about the over-bloated part of the bureaucracy in the country, where we have about 10% of our jobs and of our population are public sector workers, about 8,000 of them. And if we look at that as a percentage, it's 10%. You look at the UK, it's 0.6%, roughly 463,000 civil servants in the United Kingdom. So at that point, we're not looking at these essential jobs, which I think causes some uproar. Obviously, we need to invest in our education system. Obviously, we need to invest in our teachers and our doctors. But we also need to invest in our education system in the actual education. The education system doesn't teach people from a modern era. It doesn't really teach people how to think. It teaches them how to take knowledge, how to consume knowledge, and how to regurgitate knowledge. It doesn't teach them any of the core principles of any form of proper education. It doesn't teach them how to speak, how to think, and how even to debate people, or even have logic in that. So that's a key core issue of the whole part of the education system that I think goes deeper than this need to have teachers who do wonderful jobs, but the system itself that they work in is broken, and that's the part where we're discussing.
Archie, I just want to ask you, though, because you come across as an incredibly eloquent, well-spoken, well-rounded thinker. Where did that come from then, if not our education system here?
Well, I should have to thank my mother for that, I must say. Yes, she'll have my head if I don't. But I think there's a lot of outside learning that comes with that, where I spend many days just sitting there reading or doing own things. I would say that I could thank Manx Radio for some of the opportunities they've given for that as well.
Yeah, we'll leave that there, I think. You are listening to Manx Radio's budget programme. It is 12:40. We'll be back after this. And we are still here, live from the Millennium Room in the Legislative Buildings. Tynwald is ongoing as we speak, people contributing to the budget debate. Had a message in from text ending 384 that says, when government workers retire, they receive a huge lump sum. When will the government stop this lump sum costing us taxpayers millions? They don't contribute to it, so why pay it? If you've got any thoughts, comments or questions, 166 177, or you can email studio@manxradio.com.
I can feel the public sector unions steaming at that last comment. Of course, latterly, public sector workers do pay and contribute towards their pensions to a far fairer state than they used to. Vicky Cottier, you're in the food sector. Are you happy with what's in this budget, or were you hoping for something else?
Well, I think for the food and drink sector, the ultimate would have been a reduction in the VAT rate. I think VAT is something that consistently causes many of our cafes and pubs and restaurants to go under. So I did know, I knew that it wouldn't happen, that we'd get that VAT reduction. But I think hospitality is it's a wonderful industry because it is such a great contributor to our society. It's a great place to help people manage their mental health, to gather, to have fun. And also it's a great sector to work in, from students wanting to save a bit of money to, help them with their studies, to young parents who want to work within, school hours and stuff. So it's a really, really important sector. And I think we've seen some places go under that we really didn't expect to go under. So that has been really tough. And we're still really, really impacted by COVID because we had to use up all of our reserves. And I mean all of our reserves. And put in even more. I'd say the majority of restaurants, pubs and cafes probably had to take out additional funding through bank loans, overdrafts, credit cards. I know it because I'm in it. And we're still really, really struggling because we're in another winter without reserves. So for the first time ever, we're using our overdraft facility, which is, it's really not a nice position. And we are, I would say, one of the busiest cafes on the island. And I think people look at us and think, you must be loaded, because they just see the pounds and the pounds going across the counter. But I tell you what, they get dispersed straight away. Like, for example, just a couple of things that I was looking at this morning. On the 21st of June, a barrel, 20 litres of oil was £24.95. It's now £47. To fill up our oil tank in the 21st of June was 748 quid. On the 22nd of December 2022, it was £1,716 for the exact same thing. So we have put up our prices to customers by around about 20%, but our costs have gone up way more than that. And also, as soon as we came out of COVID, the VAT rate was changed from 5% back up to 20%. So none of us had the chance to get benefit from that VAT reduction. So that has been really, really difficult. And I think hospitality is a hard sector. We've got an 80% failure rate after 5 years across the board. It doesn't matter what decade you're in. So we do have a high failure rate. But the ones that do survive are the ones that just work really, really, really hard. And I think people are just really tired by it. And it's vital, especially if you're talking about increasing our population or increasing the numbers of tourists to the Isle of Man, we have to provide something for them. So you need to support we need support in terms of longevity. We don't want to have a sector where we have these fantastic cafes pop up, but after a year they pop back down again. We need to support us to make sure that we have longevity, sustainability, and we build the knowledge that we can pass down to other people who aspire to have restaurants and cafes, because we are the dreamers, the blue sky thinkers, and and we're important. Yeah, so and we do get brushed over quite regularly.
Vicky, can I just ask you as well, we're talking a lot about skill shortages generally, but in terms of employment for your business, how is that?
Well, what would make us go from breaking even to making profit would be if we could open 7 days a week. We've had jobs in the job centre almost consistently since September last year. We've employed one person who was from Scotland, no one from here. There's no one who is available to work in hospitality. So we can't open those 7 days a week. I know, we don't get people apply for jobs.
So, Krista McDonald, can I come to you? Because, we have talked a lot about skills shortages, and it's certainly something the Treasury Minister's been talking about. But this is an issue across the board, isn't it? I mean, we heard the latest unemployment figures yesterday, up very, very slightly. I think it stands at around 0.7%. If we can't fill the positions at this point, what hope do we really have?
No, and I think it's important, actually. It's not technically unemployment, it's job seekers. There are vastly more people unemployed on the Isle of Man who could potentially work, but for whatever reason either choose not to or aren't able to, as we heard in the room before about people struggling to pay their rent and going to potentially get evicted. Those are people who would be better off on benefits. That's wrong. I would just like to pick up on Vicky's point about the increasing costs in hospitality. I noticed that there's a £1 million profit dividend being declared out of the steam packet back up to the government. Really, that is we've struggled, and especially food retailers have massively struggled with increased freight charges by the steam packet to the Isle of Man. So that £1 million of dividend is at the expense of some of our retailers on the Isle of Man. And so rather than, we've been trying to get the Treasury Minister and the Enterprise Ministers to look at whether or not there's something that can be done to help there. Because when you look at the actual costs of a business like a cafe, their electricity is a big cost. Well, that's MUA, that's government run. Their freight, all their inbound stuff is all run by steam packets. So the government is actually in control of a vast amount of the cost centres for these smaller businesses, these hospitality businesses. So if we're going to invest in them and actually want them to survive, it's really out of the control of the people running them to some degree to make them work. Vicky's working very hard to make that happen. She can't recruit people. She's got massively increased overhead costs, and most of those are passed on through the government funding.
I should say the steam packet isn't here to answer that question. We will put it to them later. Phil?
Yeah, Emma Orr, you could have been forgiven last year in thinking that government had wholly embraced the green agenda, but maybe this year it's a different story.
Yes, very disappointed not to see pretty much anything mentioned about climate change transition, any incentives, any change in talking about any planning or anything to get the transition moving more. It's a very important part of things for young people, is the climate change problem. And if you want, it's a huge part to encourage people here is to see we're a green island, but there's nothing showing for that. So I was very disappointed in that today.
And what would you have expected to see?
Just anything, any mention of it, any type of incentive, maybe anything increasing the payback on PV to incentivize people to put PV on their roofs, some encouragement for private companies to come along and develop projects on the island.
Okay.
Kira Sowerby, you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, I think that I completely agree. There's a complete lack of climate change mentioned in the budget. One of the things that would have been really great to see would have been an increase in the budget for public transport, which has seen a real terms cut in its budget now because all the money going to DOI seems to be going to infrastructure maintenance rather than the bus transport. The £2 cap on fares has been quite successful. As someone who uses the buses multiple times a day, it's really made a difference to my own finances, and it would be really great to see that extended to seeing public transport become free for everyone. Not only would that help some of the lower paid workers and people returning to the island from university, but it would also help reduce carbon emissions because fewer people would be driving.
I mean, that would be lovely, wouldn't it? But where would the money come from to pay for that? What would you be willing to see go in order to finance that?
Well, actually, public transport, the only costs that would be covering would be current fares that are already taken, and they make up a relatively small amount of the DOI's overall budget. However, overall, I would be willing to see more taxes taken in order to fund from the more well-paid members of society in order to fund services for the poorer.
John Webster, can I bring you in here? Thinking about taxes, actually higher earners now on the Isle of Man are going to be paying slightly more. What's your reaction to that?
I think that's good. There are a lot of people on the island and they can well afford to pay, and I'm quite happy that they should make a greater contribution. There has to be a question on the efficacy of the tax cap, whether the people who pay, say, I'm not sure what it is now, about 200,000 fixed, is it?
A joint couple, I think.
Well, the question is, should that exist? To what extent do we actually benefit from having various people, and some of them are quite well known. Should that be removed? I don't know.
Would you remove it if you could?
Yes, if I was in a position, I probably would. I'd also, I like the idea of having a progressive tax. Progressive tax is one where you take a greater percentage from those who are better off, and the removal of allowances from high paid, I think it's over 100,000, isn't it, will actually make the tax system more progressive, and I think that's not a bad thing.
Ian Crawford?
I agree with John, yes, very much the case. That's the situation we're facing. We are trying to attract new people here as well. At the other end of the scale, we're looking at looking at trying to get extra people in, but the tax rate's going to be levied at the higher level. So there's one, balance the other out, or leave the other out of touch, really. So I'm not convinced.
Well, we could hardly have a 12-to-1 slot without regular Man and Line contributor Bonzo Slater. Bonzo, what are your thoughts so far on the budget?
Well, it's supposed to be Shrove Tuesday today, isn't it? Pancake Day, the beginning of the period of Lent, where we sacrifice and how can I put it? Pleasures and generally wear hair shirts and stuff. Well, it's more like Groundhog Day, really. I mean, I've seen so many of these budgets where very little changes. There are a great deal of supposed things. I mean, I look at some of the graphics, for example, that the government are very good at putting out, and they remind me of South Park's The Underpants Gnomes and their desperate attempts to try and justify their thinking. Music to my ears when I hear John talk about tax and the fact that we need to reorientate the tax system so that we have a properly progressive tax system, and we get rid of the anomalies which have created what is essentially a welfare state, where the government gives you more money and gives you more incentives the wealthier you are. It's like the thing about the Isle of Man being a marvellous and special place to live and work. Well, it's a marvellous and special place to live and work if you're on something like 60,000 a year plus. The more that you're ahead of that figure, then certainly it gets better. Under that, it gets worse and worse and worse. And I remember when I returned to the island, half a lifetime ago, the differential between the UK personal tax allowance and the Manx personal tax allowance, well, the Manx allowance was double. And then you would have the various lower rates, 10% on the first 10,000 and then 18 on the rest. And then there would be all the things that you could set against tax. So the relatively high costs of being on the island at that time, and property actually, strangely enough, was cheaper when I came back, and also things like rates. I remember my first rates bill was something like about £150 for the year, and I've been paying, I think, about £400 a year in council tax just before. So when you look at all those things which were attractive, well, yes, everyone came. That's why the nightclubs began on Thursday night. The weekend really only ended on a Sunday lunchtime. I think we all remember those sort of days of the early 2000s. But for the past decade, at least, I mean, we've had reports on every budget about how the economy is growing, the economy is growing, the economy is growing. It sounds like Soviet Russia, because who is this growth for? Who's seeing it? For most people, real incomes have remained static. So this budget, it's really an exercise in masterly inactivity. As the Band of Brothers quote says, he's not a bad officer because he makes bad decisions. He's a bad officer because he makes no decisions.
Well, I think back to Beth now.
Well, we're nearly approaching the end of this hour, but we are going to be joined from 1 after Tim will breaks for lunch by some of the politicians. So some of these questions we're going to be able to put to them in person. And as ever, 166 177 studio@manxradio.com if you'd like to get in touch and put your thoughts, comments or questions to either our panel who are going to stay with us in the next hour or to the politicians we'll be joined by. Roy's been in touch to say, I'm fed up with unemployment socialists demanding more money and taxes from the hard-working. Persecution of the hard-working will sink the island. And G says not only do the civil servants contribute to their pensions, but their lump sum is increased by converting or reducing their pensions. So lots of thoughts. I mean, there's a lot to digest here, I think, Phil, and we will continue to do that in the next hour. But we shall take a short break and be back after this. And here we are, still live from the Millennium Room in the Legislative Buildings. Is the audience still here? Really? Wow. We are waiting this hour, Phil, for the politicians to pop in. We know they're going to be breaking for lunch very shortly. So hopefully some of the questions that we've been hearing in that first hour we'll be able to put directly to the decision makers themselves. Some really interesting text messages coming in. Any thoughts, comments or questions, 166 177, or you can email studio@manxradio.com. It's not just high earners needed to be attracted over here. If there isn't the social and hospitality things here, there is nothing for them to do. And that's something that Vicky was talking about in the first hour. Lower earners also needed to be tempted over to the Isle of Man. And an interesting one saying, what has the budget done for pensioners? Now, there is the increase in pension, 10.1%, I think, Phil?
Yes, 10.1% increase in the state pension and all the various add-ons that some pensioners get. But I'm talking now to Katie Hepworth. Katie, again, a young person interested in budgets. What would attract you to actually stay on the island in the future?
Well, at the minute, there's nothing attracting me to stay here right now. I'm attracted to come back when I want to start a family because it's safe and I wouldn't have to worry about my kids. That's one thing me and my friends always say about the Isle of Man. It's safe. You don't have to worry about people around you. But there's nothing to do here. Like, whenever me and my friends are like, what should we do? There's nothing to do here. The museums here are basically like trophies about what the Isle of Man used to be. There's nothing new. There's no art to go and see. They have little galleries. I always go with my papa to go see the art galleries. But there's no other kinds of museums around here that interest you. And it's quite a dull place at the minute. And it's safe and it's lovely. It's such a beautiful place, but it's boring.
And of course, no increase in the Arts Council budget or the Sports Council budget. A small increase in Culture Van's budget, and I think it was 3.5% increase in Manx National Heritage's budget. But you would like to see more in that area?
Yeah, I would like to just see more going on, more things happening. Like, I know we have Peel Day and we have Port Erin Day and things like that, and they're beautiful, fun family activities. But there's not something always going on that you can always go see. It's quite literally like, oh, well, there's nothing going on, let's go for a walk and look at the scenery that we've seen like 100 times.
And do you think sometimes politicians are so focused on things like tax rates and housing and all of these things that they miss the fact that people actually want to have fun things to do when they're here?
We're here to live. We're here not to just work hard, have a house, do all of that things. We need to be able to actually have fun in our lives and be able to look back and think, oh, I did that was cool. But whenever I think of things like that, I think I need to go to England, I need to go travelling, I need to go see different places that actually do things. I never think the Isle of Man is somewhere I would want to visit if I lived in England to do something with my life.
Well, I went all the way to Reggaby last night, but I'm not sure whether that counts as exciting. Well, it was quite fun.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because we do hear this time and time again, that there's nothing for people to do on the Isle of Man, particularly young people. But it's trying to drill down into what that actually means. What is it that younger people want to see over here? And some really interesting thoughts there from Katie. And Christy MacDonald, do you think there is enough to attract people over here of all ages, or are we just sort of catering for one age bracket?
I think that the common theme that we hear time and time again is that it is very safe for families and it's a great place to raise a family and things like that. The trouble with that particular demographic is you've got maybe one or two earners and then the rest of them are dependents. So that doesn't help our dependency ratio when we're looking at costs and tax. for things to do for younger people, and it's unless you like outdoor activities, which we excel obviously with our natural environment, there is very little. And I struggle to I think back to when I was younger. We had loads of nightclubs, we had cinemas all over the place. It was a very, very different environment. So I'm not entirely sure why that's changed, and I'd love to understand that a bit more, but yeah.
Well, it seems a good point that we are now just being joined by the Education Minister, Julie Edge. Julie, thank you so much for being with us. We're talking a little bit about young people now and what there is in the budget for them. From your point of view as Education Minister, what's your view on today's budget?
Certainly the key priority from an education point of view is the youth strategy, to make sure that offering is a broad offering and that it's accessible to all around the island. That's certainly one thing that's coming forward. And then obviously during the pools debate and the pools review, we are looking at having mini NSCs. Now, I know a lot of people will say that's all sporting activities. However, the youth offering and reopening of Ardwellan will be another area for it's going to come forward as a well-being centre really for our youth, and that'll be a broader offering as well. So hope that's coming online again in the next couple of months.
Now, we know it has not been an easy time for teachers over the past year, and certainly education in general. What is there in this budget that will mean in the year ahead we're not going to see more of the same, more strikes?
So obviously there's investment in this budget. The island has invested in new money towards our pay and conditions for our teachers. It's not like other jurisdictions where within service they've had to find increases for their staff. So we've invested in that for all of our teachers, and hopefully we're on the right footing now. We've increased the starting salary for our teachers to ensure that we're attracting teachers to the island, to the profession. That has gone up to 36,557, and that's significant change. It's near enough a £10,000 pay award in year for those starting salaries, and we will continue. We need to continue to invest in our education system for the future of the island.
Geraldine O'Neill from the NASUWT, is there enough in this budget from your point of view?
Yes, well, most definitely we are pleased that there is that increase for new starters. However, Julie, the problem we have always with this is that we have people who come over and they get incentives, and that is a really good starting salary. But already I can tell you, talking to young teachers, that they will leave after the 3 years. What we want really is investment in those who are here and recruitment and retention here. You will be aware that most of our teaching staff here, well, at least 50% of them are over 50. So therefore, it's that staff really that need the incentives to be able to continue to live and work here. And I'm also aware, as you are, that there is presently a funding review that is taking place. We hope that the trade unions, as stakeholders, will actually have some part in those discussions, because they do really need to be substantive discussions, Julie. You were very much in favour of the Beeman's report, I know that, and supported us all in that area at that time. We need this funding review to be as robust as that was, and that it has to actually listen to all sides in this funding review, that actually funding is not just capital funding, it's funding in your staff. And without funding in the staff to deliver the services, then it's not going to be a funding review that's going to have the impact that we want to see. And also, I totally accept what you're saying. We're working very well. We are working together. You know, they are difficult times, and we're working constantly in negotiations, as you're aware. However, we do have to face facts, and the facts are that we have teachers who have had pay erosion for the last 10 to 12 years. So we need some restorative looking at that alongside what's happening, because at the moment increases are barely dealing with inflation.
Julie
and we
Edge,
still have the massive problem with retention.
Thank you, Geraldine. Julie?
Thank you. Yeah, and I know Geraldine's passionate about getting this sorted as much as we are as a department. We've got to commit to achieving this. Funding review is being carried out under the remit of the Chief Secretary. It wouldn't be right for my department to be carrying out that funding review. However, my department are fully involved. They have currently been around a large number of our schools. We have advised them that they need to talk to all stakeholders, and that will include unions. I am passionate that a funding review has never been carried out in our education system, and that's what needs to happen, and that is what will be delivered. With regards to what will be delivered, it will go back to the Chief Secretary, and obviously that will be discussed by the Council of Ministers. Do I want that to come forward as soon as possible? Yes, I do. But with regards to recruitment, and yes, we have lifted that starting salary, retention, it was mentioned that we have got a large workforce, or we've got a large number of people over 50. I'm pleased they've stayed here. Do we need to sort cliff edges out with funding, with people coming over and getting housing allowances? We do, and we are looking at that. And we will get everything sorted. We need to get education back as a sustainable, stable footing for the future of the island, and that comes through our young people.
Julie, I just wanted to mention something that caught my eye. £500,000 for funding for mobile classrooms. I wonder if some people are thinking, why are we spending money on schooling our children in sheds? How does that make the Isle of Man an attractive place and make families want to come over here?
So certainly, obviously, we have in-year movement in our schools. There's a lot of people do move to the island, and that puts extra pressure on our schools. With regards to mobile classrooms, I'm keen to look at our catchment areas, make sure that we've got the right facilities for all of our students, and it's equally accessible to them throughout the island. £500,000 for mobile classrooms, that needs to be in there in case of any shift or significant shift. We are looking to grow the population, and whether that actually gets used would be a matter to discuss at that time. Ballacameen High School has 10 mobile classrooms on it. Currently, the numbers on roll at Ballacameen has decreased. I think it's gone down 100 this year. So, there's opportunity for us within our education establishment and all of our facilities to look at this and make sure it's the best value for the taxpayer of the island.
Well, speaking of schools, we are also joined by Arbury, Carstown and Maloo MHK, Tim Glover. Now, last year you said you'd be one of the MHKs who wouldn't vote for the budget this year if there wasn't more movement on a new Castle Rushen High School. Is there enough for you to vote on the budget and give it your approval?
On that specific matter, yes. There's other matters that I'm listening to the debate very intently, but I will compliment Julie as Minister of Education because she has engaged with the Southern MHKs. We felt this had rumbled on for many, many years, the debate over a replacement of Castle Rushen High School, and we knew about the dilapidated state of the Southern Community Pool, which has been very much endorsed by the report we've had. So we wanted to draw a red line. We wrote a letter, the 4 Southern MHKs, to the Education Minister, to 2 Treasury Ministers during this last year, and we had a meeting about a week ago in which we saw about a 90-page document which is a long way further down the road than we've ever been before. And the fact that if you look at it starkly, it's in exactly the same place, just a different page number in terms of the pink book, but there is a lot more emphasis, and I was very pleased that the Treasury Minister did indeed mention that being pretty much top of the queue.
OK, so that's a positive in your view, but you mentioned you were listening very closely to debate. Other matters on your mind?
I did vote against the island plan, and it was purely because I think in terms of getting an island plan up and running, we've got to deal with a heck of a lot of issues that we've currently got on our books. And one of them is teachers, one of them is the lack of doctors, the lack of primary care, the crisis that we've got there, which has been exemplified again in my constituency with the situation at Bala Medical School. So I really feel we've got to put an emphasis on dealing with the current multiple issues that we've got, and then you've got then the building blocks and the foundation to move on to the ambitions within the island plan.
I wonder if some people, though, listening, Tim Glover, think, that's laudable, and I maybe think they understand what it is you're saying, but what does that actually mean in practice? What is it that you are not seeing then in this budget?
At the moment, I haven't seen a lot about addressing those issues, and I want to see that. I'm concerned as well about the amount of reserves that we're paying out over the next 5 years just to keep our heads above water. And I'm concerned as well that if we do spend the reserves, and this has been echoed so far by quite a lot of backbenchers, the spending of the reserves and the legacy then we hand over to future administrations and future generations. The spending has got to be done carefully, and this is pretty liberal, to say the least.
Will you be voting for the budget,
I haven't made my mind up yet. There's still a debate to be had, and that's what the purpose of the Tynwald debate is.
Just a quick question then to Julie Edge in relation to the additional educational needs. I noted in the Pink Book that it mentioned that the department had bid for substantially more than you actually got, and effectively, we've heard in the first hour of the programme that quite a lot of concern about the way in which government is spending reserves, but you're not getting everything that you asked for, are you?
No, and certainly on our additional educational needs budget, that's been a growing budget over a number of years. It currently sits at £14 million. And obviously in this budget, we've got a ring-fenced of £2 million. We need to make sure that is getting spent in the right areas and that the actual delivery of support to our students is there on the ground. £2 million is quite significant because you cannot just employ people off the street. It is some of the areas are specialist, and we need to make sure we've got well qualified people in our schools to help support the students with their needs. Certainly post-COVID is talked about an awful lot, and the challenges. I was in a school last week, and it actually brought it home really when you've got a head teacher saying these children have not had 2 full years in school, and I thought that is significant to those youngsters. But we will ensure that the support's there. Our teachers and head teachers are the professionals. They're the best to say what support's required. That £2 million is available and will be made available to our schools to provide that additional support going forward. With regards to sustainable, that will be, I'm hopeful, an addition year on year, and I think that's the only way to support all of our children with needs in our schools. And we do have specialist provision areas on the island. We're not like the UK. We're a fully inclusive education system, and that does put some challenges. When people are thinking, well, why aren't you doing the same as the UK? Because we're fully inclusive. We want all our children to have the same experience.
Richard Holmes, you've sat quietly so far, but hopefully you're going to spring into action now.
Yeah, well, I think what Tim Glover, MHK, said was very key. We've got to focus on the actual structural deficit. Unfortunately, that's only on page 4 of the printed speech by Dr. Allinson, and it should be the top and then the end, right? Because when you blowing £152 million in 1 year, which is approximately £2,000 ahead of the population from the reserves, then that is the problem that needs to be dealt with. At the same time, in the Treasury and the little summary note points out as the first risk and challenge a shortage of skills in the employment sector, and in the hour before we heard a lot about the lack of job seekers. So isn't it an obvious solution to when you are spending too much money and you have people needing skilled staff, to let skilled staff go from government and go into the employment sector or the private sector, because there wouldn't be a situation of those people then moving into the unemployment statistics because the jobs are there. In effect, £150 million, assuming 42,000, I think was the number that was mentioned, as an average salary for people. It's with, let's say, 10, 12,000 employees on the island working for the government. That implies about 2,500 to 3,000 people overemployed, and I wonder if the private sector probably could actually soak up, as it were, that amount of people.
Julie Edge, I mean, it's often stated, isn't it, that there are lots of middle management in government just waiting to be culled. Why does government not cull them?
Certainly it's always a question that's asked, and it's always called for, certainly around election time, and that's what I'll speak about. I won't speak as Education Minister, but certainly on the doorstep there's a lot of challenge around that. My experience, I was a civil servant prior to becoming an MHK. There are a lot of hard-working public servants, whether that's civil servants, and I think people do get them confused. A civil servant is quite a small number, but the rest of them are our public servants, and they could be our police, our bus drivers, our scientists and that. So there's a diverse range of employees that we have. With regards to reducing them, I have to say, and Geraldine mentioned it before, the Beamans report, I was one of the main instigators to make sure that independent review was done when I was a backbencher. And there was significant challenge around the size and structure of the department and the head office. Since I've taken up my position, it's actually probably one of the smallest served administrative sides of government. And however, we're servicing 12,000 young people in our schools. So I think there are challenges. I think sometimes a rebalance of employee groups is the right way to go. It's not a piece of work that is coming forward that I'm aware of, but I completely accept, that challenge. With regards to skills and what we're doing about that, we're certainly setting up an education, skills and futures board that will be coming forward shortly, because I think that's key to make sure that we have the right skills available and pathways for people. Not everybody needs to go off the island to get an academic career. They could study on island in the workplace with a large number of the employers, and I think that's key, that we need to start looking at that again to make sure that that access to that. And then we also retain some of our young on the island working in our hospitality sector, and that at the weekends. That's certainly where I came from. I was working and studying at the same time. And I think there's a lot the island has to offer to everybody, and we need to all work together. And that includes education, skills, working with the employee groups.
Paul Hardman, the Treasury Minister's just entered the room. Anything particular you want to say to the Treasury Minister?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite appropriate that he walks in at a time when I'm going to say that, a budget is a difficult job for anybody, and it is a very subjective thing for people to have views on any budget, whatever that is, whether that's when a swimming pool is built, who is a public sector worker, who is a private sector worker. I think that there's some very pertinent points that we should be touching on here. I actually mentioned that as a percentage of the overall population, and we're talking public sector workers now rather than civil servants, and we have to make that distinction that actually 23% of the working population is public sector workers on the island. If you compare that with the UK, 3% of the working population are deemed as public sector, and if you compare that with the US, 13%. Now that is a very difficult book to balance, and I just think that everybody should be aware of everybody's individual subjective views on this thing, whether it's education, whether it's green issues, whether it's media and culture issues that I'm quite interested in, whether it's a swimming pool, as Sim is interested in. There is a very difficult line to tread, but the one thing that I would say is that we've heard this echoed again and again. Things need to be more dynamic, and things need to move quicker to attract people and to grow, and that is ultimately what is going to get rid of that deficit.
Lots of questions there to put to the Treasury Minister, which we will do in just a moment.
Tax and accounts feel like a grey cloud above your head. Step into the sunshine with Crow Isle of Man. Our friendly team of chartered accountants take time to listen to your business needs and work with you to prepare for the future. From tax and accounts to audit and payroll, our track record of quality and client satisfaction speaks for itself. Visit crow.im or call 627 Crow Isle of Man. Smart decisions, lasting value.
The Manx Radio Budget Special is brought to you by Crow Isle of Man, Chartered Accountants. Smart decisions, lasting value.
and this is Manx Radio's budget programme, coming up to 1:35 now. We're live from the Millennium Rooms in the Legislative Buildings. Dr Alex Allinson, Treasury Minister, is with us. Varying opinions, Dr Allinson, on the 2023 budget. Some people suggesting it appears to be a budget designed for anyone but those living on the Isle of Man, with the most money going towards this population increase aim. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that's wrong. I mean, it is very difficult, as some of your audience have said, to balance a budget, or even try to attempt to balance a budget during a difficult time period. We do have an island plan and an economic strategy which looks at growing the active population, and I think some of the things we've been talking about today show why that we're dealing with increasing demand for government services. Quite rightly, we're dealing with making sure that people on the Isle of Man get a decent wage for a decent day's work. Absolutely right. We're looking at increasing the median wage for people who are living here and investing in the infrastructure for people living here, but also making sure we can grow our population to actually incentivise those firms that are here to stay and expand, and also attract new sectors to our island in terms of economic growth. But that's not at the expense of our heritage, culture, or the planet. And it's trying to balance all these at a time when we've got relatively high inflation as well. So it is a challenge, but I think this is a pragmatic and necessary budget for this year. It also lays some of the foundations for that development of an economic strategy, that funding of building our communities going forward.
You've been very open about the fact this is a third year of a rainy day budget, taking a significant amount of money. There goes my stomach, sorry, hungry. It's taking a significant amount of money from reserves. I mean, just how pragmatic is that? What is the plan to fill that gap in the future? Where is it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there is a plan. There has always been a plan, and actually the budget from last year, which was given by my predecessor, had a drawdown on reserves. It's just got slightly larger because of the inflationary forces we've been seeing. So I think, following on from the 2 years of the pandemic, we are still playing catch up in terms of meeting revenue with expenditure at a time when we are spending more on those key frontline services, particularly health and education, and quite rightly so, because that's how we grow our communities and that's how we support them. Going forward, the 5-year plan looks at increasing government revenue so that we can rebalance some of that expenditure. But we will need to make those difficult decisions about how we increase revenue. That isn't just about taxing working people. It has to be broader than that, and broadening the tax base, as well as looking at other avenues for actually getting finance in. Drawdown on reserves. Again, my colleagues have criticised that, but also criticised the ability for us to spend on those key public services, and wants to do more in terms of benefits. The reserves are there for a reason, and I would not be comfortable bringing in cuts in frontline services at a time when we've got almost, just over £1.7 billion in reserves. They are there for a reason. The National Insurance Fund is there for a reason. It's there to fund present benefits, and also the benefits for those generations that come after us. But again, one of the things we'll be doing during the year is doing an assessment of how big that fund needs to be. Does it really have to be over £900 million that's sitting, being invested, often offshore, whereas it could be repurposed to actually provide those investments into our own island, and actually provides the extra investment we need into our people.
Just wondering, Treasury Minister, do you think you've missed a trick with this year's budget, in as much as you've explained the nature of the problem, the structural deficit in terms of tax and spend, but maybe there could have been a bit more focus on the economic strategy and how government is actually going to deliver or effectively fill the gap between where we are at the moment, which is expenditure substantially higher than income.
No, so Phil, no, I don't think I've missed the trick. I mean, this is a budget debate. It's part of a far wider debate. I think you're absolutely right, because the budget funds all the ambitions of an administration. But we've had long debates about the Island Plan, we've had long debates about the economic strategy. This comes down to how we fund it, but being realistic how we fund it as well. It's been very interesting that different people in the court today have got different ideas. Some are worried about taxing people more. Some are concerned that we're not spending enough on benefits. you have to be realistic. This money has to come from somewhere. At the moment, a proportion of that £1.2 billion is coming from reserves. But that will reduce over those 5 years. But in terms of the budget, this is, as I said, laying the foundations for that investment in the Island Plan and the economic strategy. Part of that work has already started, and I hope that we can then build on that. But one of the things I think I have been quite honest about is trying to do a budget at the moment, given all the different variables in around the world and particularly economic variables, is going to be very difficult. This has to be seen more as an estimate of what's going to be happening. Again, quite a few members were talking about the assumptions in it. We have to make assumptions if we're going to have forecasts. There's no other way around it. We can't look at what's happened in the past and try to extrapolate that anymore. But what we can do is constantly review how we're doing. One of the things that this administration has done is publish in the economic dashboard, which is available to the public, to see in real time where we are in things like reserves, expenditure, revenue. So we can look at that, but I've also given that commitment to come back to the court in July with an update on where the economy is going, with an update on our spending and on our revenue. And if we need to reset that during the year, then we will absolutely do that.
David Ashford, MHK, this budget is your legacy. You happy with that?
Well, I wouldn't quite say it's my legacy. I think that's stretching it a bit. The 5-year financial plan has changed substantially, in fact, since the last budget. I think even the Treasury Minister would accept that. The forecasts going forward, particularly in relation to the reserves, are very much different. So, for instance, the budget last year was predicting the reserves at the end of the administration would be roughly around about 350 million in the general reserve. We're now saying in this budget it's going to be 188 million. Which to my mind is a worrying level for it to get down to.
But part of that isn't just about expenditure, part of that is about the value of the reserves, which has taken a big hit because of the change in the stock market.
It has, but even if you factor in the market and the way the markets have gone, including market growth that is now recovering at around about 8%, the amount that there will be spent over the next 5 years will leave the reserves at the lowest level for about 4 or 5 administrations. You've got to go back to when the general reserve was at that level. And you're not just spending the interest on the reserves, which previous administrations have done, you're actually spending the capital. Yeah. And the bit that really concerns me is that means you've got to surrender assets. And you've got to have proper governance in place to ensure you're surrendering the right assets at the right time.
So I won't spoil my summing up speech with your comments, but I do take your concerns very much on board.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because it's about taking ownership sometimes, and the public wants to see somebody saying, you know, I made those decisions, but budgets, I guess, are about predictions, aren't they? Nobody could foretell a lot of the things that were going to happen, David Ashford, but it's one of those things to say, well, this really hasn't got anything to do with me when you were in that position.
Well, no, I didn't say that. I said it's not my legacy is what I would say. Budgets are absolutely unique. What I would say is we've got to recognise the problems going forward, and what I said in my speech in Tynwald before is I will be supporting this budget. I started off by pointing out it's a difficult environment, and I don't think anyone envies the Treasury Minister delivering a budget in the middle of a cost of living crisis. But what I've said is what worries me is if those forecasts turn out to be true, we can see the direction of travel, and it takes very, very little to be wrong for the reserves to be in a catastrophic position, to be frank. If government's income and expenditure forecasts are out by as little as 2% year on year going forward, then the reserves drop to a level where the next administration won't be having a legacy handed over to them. And if you go back over the last 15 years of pink books, it's not unrealistic to actually think those forecasts could be out by that amount. So I'm supporting the budget this year, I'm wholeheartedly supporting it, but I've laid down a marker that if things start to slip going forward, my support can't be guaranteed in years to come.
Joni Farragher is also with us. What are your thoughts on the budget so far, Joni?
So, as I said in my speech in Tynwald, I will be supporting this budget. I think overall, I like the ethos and the direction of it, as the Treasury Minister outlined in his speech. I did have some concerns around our approach to the climate change funding strategy, which I outlined, and I think we have committed ourselves to putting climate change funding as a priority. And we've also committed ourselves to quite a lot of actually quite strict targets in the next few years. For example, 15% reduction in transport strategy and a 15% reduction in agricultural emissions. We don't seem to have any funding allocated to support departments in achieving those targets. So I'm concerned about where we're going to be finding the funding for this climate change funding strategy, which is supposed to be developed this year.
Katie, no, not Katie, that's your daughter. Tracy Hepworth, you had some very interesting comments in the first hour of the programme. You are quite concerned about retaining people on the island, aren't you?
I am concerned about retaining people on the island, and also the education of people who are coming back to the island as well. I think the island is missing a trick, that people who have been educated and have lived on the island and then leave the island to go to further education, to attract them back again, you need to provide resources. So if you have two individual people who have done a degree in the UK, one who's come from the Isle of Man and one who's come from the UK, the person who's educated in the UK will get more help and support coming to work on the island for a short period of time than somebody who knows the island and is likely to come and stay on the island. And I think the island is missing a complete trick in people who are already primed would love to come back and work on the island to be able to provide affordable housing, and also a way of saying that you can go to university, we will help with your funding to go to university if you promise to come back. We will pay your student loans off and help you get on the housing ladder if you return to the Isle of Man. That's what other countries all around the world are doing, and there's no mention of anything like that on the island, and I have never heard of it.
Well, if I can just say, I mean, one of the things I talked about in my budget speech was the National Insurance Holiday, and that's particularly aimed at those returning students who are coming back, who get a refund of the national insurance they pay. Now, money isn't just the reason for people come back to the island. It is a help, and I agree with you that some of the initiatives we can do through education are really quite important. I mean, on the Isle of Man, people get the majority of their tuition fees paid for them, but they don't get necessarily the access to government-backed student loans. Now, there are problems with student loans in the UK that are being looked at. I think going forward, having that ability to attract the best and the brightest back to our island and giving them some benefits in terms of reducing their student debt will be very worthwhile. And that's certainly something I know that the Education Department are looking at. Going forwards, we also, you're quite right, need to look at things like affordable housing, and that has become far more of an issue, both in terms of buying a house and renting, which is why the Housing Communities Board has been set up to try to address some of these things through mortgage support, through looking at shared equity, for looking at some of the other schemes that are available across. People don't come back to the island for a whole range of reasons, and I wouldn't want to have any golden handcuffs that would chain people to our island. But part of the economic strategy is to produce a far more vibrant and attractive island for people to move back to, rather than stay in some of the big cities like Liverpool, Manchester or London.
Treasury Minister, what some people have said this morning that they'd like to have seen is more of a focus, though, on this housing issue, which is, it's massive, isn't it? If people haven't got anywhere to live, or they haven't got anywhere affordable to live, they're not going to want to stay here or move over here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things the Chief Minister did when he took office was set up the Housing Communities Board to address these very subjects in terms of what the issue really is. We've heard in the chamber today about vacant properties. How can we bring those back into operation? But we know that there is a conflict sometimes between urban development, and the Manx Development Corporation have got two headline schemes in Douglas to develop brownfield sites, with greenfield site development and some objections from local residents about that. So we're trying to get that balance right. What we need is affordable and accessible housing on this island, and there are a range of ways of getting that, both through what we're doing as a government, but also things like the Infrastructure Investment Scheme, which is enabling private firms to come forward with brownfield development themselves to try to reach this. But again, to build a house takes time. What we need at the moment is to fill some of the vacancies we have here. So it's attracting those people who may have gone across and are looking at whether to come back to the island or not, and showing what financial incentives we can do to make them to allow them to make the right choice.
Dean Kuchar, I mean, you have the Treasury Minister and the Chief Minister in front of you now. You're hoping to set up a business on the island. Are you hearing the right sort of messages?
Yeah, I am. I think it's a very healthy debate here. I'm really impressed with the government that is open to this discussion. People in this room really seem smart and have a lot of really good points that have all been brought up today. So I'm very optimistic that this we'll work this out, because the island has so much to offer. And I think it's really healthy debate that's going on, and I've heard a lot of really good things come out today. So yeah, I'm very optimistic. I think this is the way to take on real issues and talk about them.
We are joined by the Chief Minister, Alfred Cannon. Thank you so much for being here. Chief Minister, a lot has been said today. Obviously, you won't have heard the majority of it, but there are some concerns about the policy of growing the Isle of Man's population by this 15,000 in the next few years or so, when actually, are we not doing enough for the people that are already here? Is there not enough focus on actually making sure that they're happy, that they have the services they need before we look elsewhere?
So first of all, Beth, thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate the Treasury Minister on his first budget. I think it was a sensible and calm budget in very, very difficult circumstances. And I think what the budget has done really is laid out the size of the challenge in front of us now. And really, I think set a challenge for us to come up with a more concise plan for next year in terms of some of the fundamentals of tackling that, and also to demonstrate that we have made progress in some of the areas that we continually talk about, such as housing. But I really need to sort of change the emphasis of the conversation around this 100,000. It's not just about putting 15,000 people on the island. This is about creating 5,000 new jobs, and that's fundamentally what we're interested in. It's about growing the economy. It's increasing our economic activity. It's increasing our contribution to government finances, to the public purse, and it's setting about on a course to help recorrect the demographic issues that we can see facing us and challenging us as an island. So I think just can put it into context of saying, well, it's just 15,000 new people, really fundamentally misses the point of that economic strategy. Fundamentally, it's 5,000 new jobs.
I mean, that's the headline, though, isn't it? That's what people hear. And where are these 5,000 jobs going to be? Who are they?
Well, I think some of that needs to be answered more concisely by government. That's absolutely clear. We do need to set more targeted growth plans and to identify where that sector growth comes from. So, but, you know, we need to translate that down into the 1,800 jobs we've committed to for this administration. And already in the first year, we've created almost 500 of those new jobs effectively, or put 500 new people onto our economically active register. So there's already we've reduced that already to 1,300, which we've got to get on with. And alongside that, we've committed to the 1,000 new houses and also meeting the £75 million worth of additional revenue. So we're already on the way to starting to achieve that. And of course, it's got lots of benefits that we can see as well, which includes more sustainability for the island. And I say sustainability for our town centres, more sustainable housing programmes and propositions, programmes that involve, by the way, leveraging the private sector's involvement in order to help deliver fundamentally large swathes of these plans. And also, I think when we see the pressures on our town centres, the shopping pressures, the pressures that people are asking for, or the raising of the standards people are asking for when it comes to things like nightlife entertainment, for example, and that was the subject last year, then this plan is set out to tackle some of those fundamental issues. And of course, alongside that, you know, government's always going to have the challenge of delivering public services. So if we just stand still and do nothing, we will still exacerbate the problem and have the problem ongoing of delivering for our public services. So we've got to be bold and ambitious, and I think that's what we've done by setting out this plan. And yes, there's a lot to do and achieve alongside it, but those challenges will always exist. The danger of just standing still and saying, oh, just accept the status quo, solve all your problems, and then try and do something ambitious, is by the time we do that, we'll have been left behind. We'll have left behind economically. We won't have gripped some of the demographic issues, and I suspect we may well have missed some of our economic opportunities as well.
I mean, what you say seems to make sense, but I just wonder how well you're doing at bringing the public along with you. How well do they understand what it is you're saying?
Well, I think the public are clear. I think we couldn't have been more clearer about what we're trying to do. And I've spoken to a lot of people who totally understand and get it. And I hear obviously a lot of people coming back and saying, look, you know, we don't want you to grow the island. You know, we think services are under enough pressure. But I think, as I said, Beth, right at the very beginning, it's not just about. I think a lot of people under this misconception of just grow the island by 15,000 people. It doesn't really matter who they are. It really does matter who they are in terms of actually the fundamental core to that has to be the 5,000 new jobs. And alongside that, then we expect this additional natural growth.
Talking about services stretch, Laurie Hooper joins us now, her Health Minister. I think it's fair to say, and I think you'd probably agree with this, Dr. Hanson, that the Health Department didn't necessarily get the budget they wanted. There was more that, Laurie Hooper, you would have asked for?
I think it is fair to say the Health Department never gets the budget that it wants, and there's always more that we would ask for. I think what we've ended up with is a reasonable settlement given the financial position that we know we're in. What I've talked about previously and what I'm going to continue talking about, especially this year, is about consolidation. So you've just heard the Chief Minister there talking about making sure we plan our infrastructure correctly, making sure we can deliver public services. That's absolutely what this year is about. So it's not about flashy new schemes and champagne projects. This is about making sure the services we have are working well for the people that need them.
Archie Elliott, are you convinced by government's messages that do you know what the plan is, and are you convinced by it?
I'm not sure necessarily a very good metric to work out if people understand in the general populace the overall implications of the budget, because I do pay relatively close attention to it. But I don't quite agree with the overall message. I don't believe personally in reaching 100,000 head of population is necessarily a beneficial thing. And I remember in my early childhood on the island, it was a much better place. It may have been through childlike eyes, so potentially it's a utopian view, but I felt the beauty of the island is that it's quite a quiet place. It's something quite tranquil, quite easy to relax. And in recent years, I think our infrastructure probably, I don't think, could handle it. The traffic problems, you could argue it's better traffic than the UK. There's quite a lot more traffic. The roads are in a worse condition. And I think generally it's not so tranquil anymore. Everything seems to be a bit busier, which I personally, it may come from my own standpoint, but I don't see it as a beneficial thing necessarily.
I think what we don't want is Archie in charge of your marketing, Chief Minister. Laurie Hooper.
I was just going to say, really, to talk about that from a health perspective. I mean, the reality is people get older. That's what happens. So as our population ages, people age out of the workforce, people age into needing more care and more support. So you either have to replace those people in the workforce, or you have to get rid of the people who are aging out of the workforce and who need care. I would be strongly arguing against the latter. I think the only way of providing the services we need is to make sure we have people to provide the services. So in short, if you can find me a way of employing 200 more nurses without physically moving 200 nurses to the Isle of Man and growing our population by 200, I'm all open for it. But the reality is it isn't possible. So if we want to maintain services at the level, even at the level we have now, we need to bring in more people who are working to provide for that increased demand that we're seeing, and that demand is coming predominantly because we are all getting older. So either you need to invent some way of us not getting older, or we need to hire more people. And the reality is both of those would actually increase the population. So whatever we do, we are going to see an increased population on the Isle of Man. This is why the Island Plan specifically doesn't talk about growing the population. It talks very specifically about making sure our infrastructure and our services are right to accommodate that larger population, because that larger population has to come one way or the other. Otherwise, we are going to find ourselves in some real difficulties in terms of delivering services, especially in the healthcare space.
There is a danger, though, isn't there, if we constantly talk about the ageing population, that older people in the Isle of Man feel like a burden, and I think that is a message that they seem to be feeling.
Well, I think you have to. Well, I think the government's set out the problems and we've set out the solutions. I mean, this conversation is not unique to the Isle of Man. It is happening almost daily in the national UK press, and it's probably happening further afield in other developing economies as well. You know, I don't think unless there's a recognition of the challenges that you're going to necessarily drive the solutions. Now, we have come up with our solution. We have come up with an economic plan for the island, and it's an economic plan that we all fundamentally believe in. It's going to have a huge number of benefits. It's not just about ageing populations. This is also about creating new industries, driving a more sustainable island, creating the environment that business and industry want. And just to go back to the point, I mean, I think we can all look back with some fondness to our childhood Halixon days, if you like, in terms of the way the island certainly has been in the past. The brutal truth is now, you know, business and industry are really looking for something different. They're looking for faster moving economy. They're looking for now.
If I can just interrupt you there, apologies, Chief Minister, but just speaking about business, Vicky Cottier.
So I work in the hospitality sector, and I think, as Archie said, one of the great things about the island is that it is a really beautiful island, and that is one of the things that is going to attract people to the island to work as well. regardless of what sector or what position, what job they have. And it's very important for the hospitality sector to provide something for them to do. And it is a very valuable place in terms of the mental health of our society, and also the multiplier effect within our local economy, because virtually everything that is spent within our cafe and all the restaurants goes right back into our economy. So that is really important. And I think there is an attitude of, well, the hospitality sector is fine because, they drop out and then more will come up to, to fill in those spaces. But I think it frustrates me, that attitude, because I think what we need is support to provide longevity, because we need places for our tourists and our locals to go to, because there's not many places left from 5-10 years ago. And so we need to be valued and supported too.
I think just a couple of minutes before the end of the programme, would you like to respond to that, Treasury Minister?
Yeah, I mean, when KPMG did their initial assessment in terms of the economic strategy, they put hospitality as one of the foundations there that would drive that sustainability, drive that attractiveness to the Isle of Man. So I think you're absolutely right. But again, going back to the other comments, doing nothing is not an option. It is simply not an option. I would not have taken on this job if I thought, I'll just do a budget like last year. Things change. We have to adapt, because the alternative is that our communities will suffer, our society will dwindle, and the ability for the government to provide for people, whether it's support for health or support for hospitality, goes out of the window. If we don't have that revenue coming in, government can't do what it does. And I think one of your other speakers talked about the role of government, the amount of people who are employed by government. That's because we run horse trams, heritage rail, and a theatre to provide that culture. Now, whether we should do that or farm that off for somebody else is another matter. But that's what we're doing at the moment, and we have to have the revenue to provide for that.
Treasury Minister, thank you so much. And that is just about all we have time for on this programme. Thank you so much to our panellists and guests, to the Manx Radio production and engineering team, the Tynwald team who have allowed us to broadcast from the Millennium Room, Crow Isle of Man for sponsoring the broadcast, and of course to you for listening. Much more analysis to come in the next few days. If you'd like to take a comprehensive look at the budget breakdown, you can find a link on the homepage at manxradio.com, and the Tynwald coverage will continue at 2:30 on AM 1368. But for now, that's all from us. Thank you very much.